There is a generation in America that nobody really talks about. They weren't celebrated like the boomers. They weren't endlessly analyzed like millennials. And they weren't feared or obsessed over like Gen Z. They exist quietly in the middle, invisible, overlooked, forgotten. But psychologists who study generational behavior say something fascinating. Generation X may be the most psychologically complex generation in modern American history. They were the first generation raised without constant supervision. The first kids who came home from school to an empty house. The first to watch their parents' marriages fall apart in real time. The first to be handed the world and told, figure it out yourself. And they did, but it came with a cost. A psychological cost that many of them are still paying today. Today on MindDark, we're diving into the dark psychology of Generation X, the generation that learned how to survive by becoming emotionally invisible. Stay until point number 4, because what happened psychologically to Gen X is happening to millions of people today, whether you're Gen X or not. Born between 1965 and 1980, Generation X grew up during one of the most unstable periods for families in modern history. By the 1970s and 80s, nearly half of all marriages were ending in divorce, which meant millions of children came home from school to the same quiet reality. An empty house, no parent waiting, no supervision, no guidance. Just hours of being alone. They made their own meals. They solved their own problems. They handled their own fears, alone. Psychologists later called this the Latchkey Kid phenomenon, but the real damage wasn't something people could easily see. It happened quietly inside the mind. Children who grow up this way learn one powerful rule very early in life. Don't depend on anyone, because anyone can leave. That belief doesn't disappear with age. It slowly becomes a lifelong mindset. Trust becomes harder. Emotional walls grow stronger. Self-reliance becomes extreme, to the point where independence slowly turns into isolation. It wasn't weakness, it was adaptation. But adapting to trauma is still trauma. In psychology, there is a concept known as the middle child effect. In many ways, Generation X became the middle child of entire generations. The generation before them experienced economic growth and stability. The generation after them grew up in a culture filled with encouragement and attention. But Generation X often heard a very different message. You'll be fine. Stop complaining. Mental health was rarely discussed. Vulnerability was rarely encouraged. Very few people stopped to ask how they were actually feeling. Over time, this shaped the mindset of an entire generation. Research shows Generation X developed higher levels of cynicism and distrust toward institutions than most other generations. They don't easily trust corporations. They don't easily trust systems. Not because they are paranoid, but because many of them watched those systems fail people around them while they were growing up. To cope with this environment, Generation X developed something psychologists call emotional detachment, a defense mechanism. When emotional support is missing, the brain adapts by lowering emotional dependence. Expect less, need less, feel less, at least on the surface. As children, this strategy helped them function. But as adults, the same emotional armor became difficult to remove. Many people describe Generation X as emotionally hard to reach. Not cold, just guarded, because they learned early that vulnerability often goes unanswered. But this same emotional control created something powerful: resilience. Generation X lived through repeated global shocks, economic recessions, major market crashes, global crisis. And each time the world seemed unstable, they simply kept going. No dramatic reaction, no public collapse, just quiet endurance. Because many of them had already learned how to handle instability long before adulthood. Another interesting pattern appeared in this generation. Many of them learned to live with two identities: the public self and the private self. On the outside, they appeared strong, reliable, and capable, but internally many carried unspoken loneliness and exhaustion. Today, psychologists describe a similar pattern as high-functioning depression, a condition where someone continues to perform, work, and succeed, while quietly struggling inside it. And many researchers believe Generation X normalized this pattern long before society even had a name for it, not because they were broken, but because the world around them taught them to hide emotional struggle. Psychologists once predicted something about this generation. They believed these emotional coping patterns would spread into future generations. And decades later, we are seeing signs of that prediction everywhere. Rising anxiety, growing loneliness, a culture where many people say, "I'm fine," even when they are not. In many ways, the survival mindset developed by Generation X slowly became part of modern culture itself. Not because they failed, but because they survived the only way they knew how. Despite all of this, another side of their story often gets ignored. Generation X eventually became one of the most self-sufficient generations in modern history. They built businesses. They adapted to economic crashes. They learned to rebuild after setbacks. Because when someone grows up believing they must rely on themselves, they often become capable of doing exactly that. The same hardship that shaped Generation X also strengthened them. And the psychological lesson behind their story is simple. Resilience rarely comes from comfort. Generation X never demanded recognition. They never asked for applause. They simply kept moving forward, working, adapting, building, but understanding the experiences that shaped them changes how we see an entire generation. If you are part of Generation X, much of this story may feel familiar, and if you are not, look closely. If this opened your eyes, share it with someone who belongs to the forgotten generation, and subscribe to MindDark, because every week we explore the hidden psychology shaping how people think, behave, and survive. Stay aware, stay sharp, and never stop understanding yourself.